Good evening. I'm not sure if I'm going to, should I start at 6 or is it moved forward or it isn't? Okay, okay. I'm going to start immediately because I'm going to move through history rather rapidly, so hang on to your seats. The history of women in psychedelics begins with the connection between women and sacred plants. From the earliest times, women have been associated with plants and plant life. They have tended and tasted, sown and grown, accumulating and cultivating plant wisdom. The image of the woman in her garden is an archetype, crossing time and all cultures, connecting Cleopatra, Maria Sabina, and Mountain Girl as wise in the way of plants women. The sacredness of women as projected through the arts and myths of countless prehistory cultures roots itself in the power of the feminine. The power of women to give birth with their bodies, bring forth life, and sustain it with their bodies. The power of her menses, which was seen as she who bleeds but does not die. In Taoist cosmology, women and drugs are yin linked with the earth and the inner self. They're unfathomable, pleasurable, and endlessly receptive. There is a Western tradition of mystical and intuitive wisdom inherent in both women and visionary states, but far more popular is the patriarchal view that regards women as inferior to men and mind-altering plants as dangerous to society and its institutions. And for this reason, these substances are demonized and criminalized. The goddesses of myth and antiquity possessed and embodied or symbolized the power of shamans, healers, and seers, and all were closely associated with entheogenic plants. Actual women of the ancient world were also believed to possess the qualities and were elevated to the status of queens and goddesses. All were active in the garden of delights where these sacred plants grew. Wisdom of the infinite, gratuitous grace, and access to the divine and immortality was possible to anyone who ate of the fruits or the berries of plants, drank a potion, or inhaled a smoke made from a combination of dried leaves. Usually the smoke preparations were a combination of psychedelic cannabis, henbane, in ancient times, different herbs, a combination. Starting with the myths of antiquity, our first image is the poppy goddess. This statue, found in a sanctuary in Crete in 1400 BC, is one of the oldest artifacts linking women with drug plants. Here she wears a headdress with ripened poppy capsules, showing that the women of Crete were wise in the cultivation of opium. Opium was considered the poppy was revered as a mystery of their goddess. Demeter, let's see if I can work this. Oops, I skipped one. Oh, dear. There we go. He did it. Thank you. Demeter, the grain goddess of ancient Greece, is shown here holding barley, poppies, and snakes. Demeter is the central figure of the Eleusinian mystery rites, at which a psychedelic potion was ingested in a 3-day ceremony at the Temple of Eleusis outside of Athens. I think most of you are familiar with the myth of Demeter and Persephone, her daughter. Persephone was kidnapped by the lord of the underworld and taken to his subterranean realms. And Demeter, her mother, was terribly grief-stricken, and she searched the earth looking for her. And finally, when she could not find her, she declared that nothing would grow until her daughter was returned. So Zeus intervened and returned Persephone from the underworld and declared that she would live with her mother 2/3 of the year, and 1/3 she would live underground. And so this myth has particularly been seen as the descent, transformation, and reemergence and eternal life of plants. And also as Persephone returns, it's been celebrated as the rites of spring. The Pleiades is a star cluster worshipped by the Vedic cult in North India around 1500 BC. It's also known as the Seven Sisters of Sleep. The story of the goddess of sleep is that she ruled over 1/3 of man's lives, and her sisters were jealous. So to appease them, she offered powers equal to her own over humanity's waking hours. These sisters were Ganja, for cannabis and hashish, Virginia, for tobacco, Erythroxylina, for coca, Amanita, for the Amanita muscaria mushroom, and Morphina, I'm sorry, I don't have this one here, Doctura, and beetle, and Morphina, oops, oh, sorry, don't quit, all right, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, these were additional images of the Pleiades. And Morphina, as shown here, resplendent in Victorian dress, casually, happily sprinkling poppy seeds on the grasshoppers. When we look at drug lore and stories that are associated with visionary plants, two dominant things are the feminine gender attached to them and creation myths, myths of birthing literally and birthing our connection to the earth and the divine. Looking at drug language and its gender connection, Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods, was the name given sacred mushrooms. In Oaxaca, they're known as mujercitas, little women, or niñas, little girls. In her ritual chants, Maztec shamaness, Maria Sabina, called them little sisters, or evoking the Christian influence, little nuns. Morning glory seeds are called by the same name as the psilocybin mushroom, Una doncella, the maiden or the virgin, and Salvia divinorum is Hojastula pastora, leaves of the shepherdess. Is that a sequence? Here are two examples of creation myths. This is a picture of Yahe woman, or ayahuasca woman. In the creation myth of the Dasana Indians of the Amazon, she was the first woman, and she appeared before a group of men who were craving religious ecstasy. She gave birth to a child who was ingested like the root of the psychoactive vine. The experience for the men is intense, their hallucinations expressive of orgasm. The sexual occurs as part of religious ecstasy for this tribe with the use of this potent psychedelic. The myth of the discovery of peyote originated with the Aztecs and later was adopted by tribes to the north. The revelation came through a vision of a woman who had just given birth. She had separated from her tribe and was lost and dying of starvation and thirst. A voice said, "Eat the plant that is growing beside you. This is the life and blessing for you and your people." She looked around and saw a small cactus, the only plant around her. She ate a piece of it and her strength returned. She nursed her child and gathered as many plants as she could and found her way safely back to her tribe, bringing peyote with her. The healing and transformative energy of psychoactive plants was studied and taught by all the leaders of antiquity. The following series of images depicts situations where psychoactive substances were bestowed by women as transformative medicine. Aztec cubensis. The warrior here is receiving his power from the mushrooms offered by the woman kneeling before him. Homer wrote of Helen of Troy, she poured into the wine they were drinking a drug, nepenthe, which lulled all pain and gave forgetfulness of grief. Nepenthe was a form of opium, likely a mixture of opium and hypnotic plants such as mandrake, belladonna, and cannabis. It also was referred to as a mirth-inspiring bowl. Helen is supposed to have received it from the Queen of Egypt, and in this image she's offering the drug cocktail to Telemachus, who is grieving over the fate of his missing father, Odysseus. This wall relief from 14th century BC Egypt shows a royal couple. The man, who appears to be ill, is being offered 2 psychoactive plants by Queen Nefertiti, the mandrake root and the blue water lily. Isis and Maria Sabina. Isis is the ancient Egyptian goddess of immortality, fertility, motherhood, and herbal cures. She healed her brother Osiris with sacred herbs, spices, and enchantments. Resembling the Crete poppy goddess and Demeter in her headdress of snakes and herbs, her worship spread from Egypt to Greece and Rome and eventually to the medieval world. Here she was known as Anima Mundi, soul of the world. Maria Sabina was the modern counterpart of Isis, who knew the healing power of certain mushrooms and conducted all-night vigils known as veladas. She was the prototype shaman woman of the 20th century, who connected the centuries-old mushroom cult, which had been underground, to the psychedelic renaissance of the 1960s. Pythia was one of the greatest shamans of ancient times. She performed the role of seer and oracle and was consulted by leaders for her prophecies on war, politics, and most important matters. She intoxicated herself by breathing fumes of burning henbane, datura, and possibly cannabis, after first chewing laurel leaves which contained very small hallucinogenic doses of cyanide. The ceremony took place at the Temple of Apollo on Mount Olympus. Snakes, sacred to the goddess religion, were kept and fed at Delphi. Small amounts of their venom may have been used for mind-altering effects. The poison path, or dark side, of drug plants can be seen here in this portrait of Circe by Pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Burne-Jones. Circe was a sorceress and devotee of Hecate, the goddess of magic. While Helen of Troy was cooling out Telemachus, his father Odysseus was having a different kind of psychoactive experience with a strong hallucinogen, the deadly nightshade, henbane, belladonna, or datura. Here Circe is slipping the potion into a mix that was given to him and his men. It was to break the will of his men if it did not outright kill them. The sailors were transformed into animals, while Odysseus had the antidote, moly, and he alone escapes. So here it happens that both father and son are given psychedelics supplied by women for very different purposes. Belladonna is another of the deadly nightshades that can produce uncontrollable visions. It derives its name from its cosmetic use by the women of the Italian Renaissance. Enlarged pupils was the ultimate beautification of your eyes. The plant here is represented as a beautiful woman. The man here is under her power, lying down helplessly anesthetized by the poisonous essence, disguised as beauty. The caption reads, "It appears to be all over for him." In the Middle Ages, the practice of witchcraft, which led to the persecution and execution of millions of women, was deeply involved with a variety of drug plants. The solanaceous ones, cannabis and opium, Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and toadstool, resulted in vivid hallucinations, time and space distortion, sensations of flying, and feelings of sexual abandon. Ritually tripping together would temporarily break the bonds and liberate women from the social and sexual power of men. The world of politics and intrigue is steeped with the use of drugs. Drugs influenced the politics of consciousness throughout history. The central religious myth of the West is the story of Eve, the first woman who was tempted by the snake in the Garden of Eden. Discoveries in the past decade show the likelihood that the toadstool mushroom was the divine entheogen of the garden. Depending on one's point of view, the snake, serpent, is the devil or wise shaman. Eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge granted the cosmic perspective, but it also led to no less than the fall of man and his expulsion from paradise. The matriarchal perspective is that Eve trusted nature more, feared it less, was more tuned into life than Adam, and had a more adventurous spirit. The fruit of the tree was the first controlled substance. Eating it resulted in the first drug bust, for which Eve took the rap, even though Adam ate it too. Eve was the rebel activist in the garden, the original drug deviant, and the first drug victim. The Eden myth can be viewed as a patriarchal cover-up for the suppression of goddess worship and nature-based paganism. So the war against drugs and the war against women have the same mythic origin. The 1001 Nights of Scheherazade exemplifies the seductive power of copious amounts of hashish that two sisters used for salvation and for political change. Pictured here with her sister, Scheherazade weaves a hypnotic spell of stories within stories. They well understood the labyrinthian, time-distorting ways of serious hash smoking. In the end, the two sisters saved their lives and tempered the ways of the brutal sultan, curing him of his habit of sleeping with a different virgin every night and having her executed in the morning. The Oris were beautiful maidens who seduced young warriors after giving them a potent mixture of opium and hashish. Marco Polo wrote, "The young men awoke in a fabulous garden where they were entertained by the most beautiful damsels who sang sweetly and danced in a manner charming to behold. After such pleasures, the men would gladly face certain death by carrying out assassinations devised by their master, Hassan Sabah. Hassan Sabah was the cunning 13th century political intriguer of Islam. He was the inventor of brainwashing with drugs in the context of set and setting. This is an early example of the Islamic concept of a paradise of virgins awaiting the suicide bomber in his afterlife." Mary Pinsent Meyer can be described as a modern-day Scheherazade. Her lover, President John Kennedy, was a bit like the Sultan, with his vast power and many mistresses. But Mary, who was on his intellectual level and a great beauty, was his favorite. She brought excellent grass for them to turn on before sex, and if certain accounts are true, she also turned him on to LSD. She and a group of influential Washington women friends, the wives and mistresses of politicians, formed a group that held LSD sessions weekly in the early 1960s. Mary privately sought trip guidance from Timothy Leary. Her plan was to introduce the forbidden fruit to end the Cold War and bring world peace. She was killed by a long-range assassin's bullet 5 months after Kennedy's death in Dallas. The director of the CIA retrieved her diary from her house and burned it. Anita Hoffman was the yippie feminist married to Abby Hoffman. She was involved in almost every serio-comic action designed to bring down the state. On Halloween of 1968, she and Abby mailed 4,000 marijuana joints to members of the New York City power structure, including the mayor, the chief of police, and members of the media. Anita was a close friend of ours and spent the last weeks of her life in our home, my husband's and mine, holding court with the many friends she had. She was brilliant and very witty and had terminal breast cancer. She called a group of us together, 4 women who were old friends, and my husband, Michael. She told us she really didn't have time to cultivate any new friendships and wanted us to be with her in her dying process. We took LSD shortly afterwards to share our personal histories and just dissolve into a kind of cosmic laughter. And a month before her death, she asked to trip one more time. It was the 6 of us once again, a very light dose of LSD, because we were all kind of on Anita's transformative journey with her at the helm. Nancy Reagan and Brownie Mary, two more contrasting women can hardly be imagined. The First Lady led the Just Say No campaign, while Brownie Mary just said yes. Brownie Mary was a grandmother in Northern California. She baked pot brownies for the young men in the AIDS community. Famous for its appetite-stimulating property, among others, cannabis revived many who were wasting away. And for this, she faced trial and imprisonment. But eventually, this was in Santa Rosa, California, they just couldn't, they didn't have the heart to do it. Sappho was one of the greatest poets of ancient Greece. In this surviving fragment of a poem, she imagines the gods themselves getting high. Peace reigned in heaven. Ambrosia stood already mixed in the wine bowl. It was Hermes who took up the jug and poured wine for the gods. Ambrosia was a mythical elixir, and in ancient Greece, when wine was used ceremonially, it always contained psychoactive substances. Mary Robinson lived in the 18th century and was a leading lady of the London stage. She was known for her romances with royalty as well as her acting. Later in life, she developed a neurological disease and retired. At home, she took opium for her condition and wrote poetry. One night, after taking near 80 drops of laudanum, which would be a psychedelic dose, she had a vivid and terrifying dream. She called her daughter and dictated 120 lines in a state of reverie, like talking in her sleep. She called it The Maniac. The next day, she remembered nothing of it. Coleridge was later to write Kubla Khan under the influence of opium, a far more popular poem. He's credited with being the first to write under the influence, but he knew of Mary Robinson. Louisa May Alcott was the beloved author of Little Women and also wrote many sensationalized short stories for the Sunday Gazette. Her stories included tales of women being drugged or accidentally overdosing themselves. Being under the influence was an acceptable literary device for her to explore taboos or behaviors that weren't acceptable to her nonconforming heroines. Alcott herself was familiar with the effects of both opium and morphine. On one of her first sojourns away from home, she volunteered as a nurse and went to Washington to help tend wounded soldiers from the Civil War. She became gravely ill with typhoid pneumonia and was treated with heroic doses of mercury. Mercury was to be outlawed the very next year, but at the time when they treated typhus and various other diseases, they used a lot of mercury. She became the consequences were devastating for much of her life. She lost a yard of her hair and wore lace caps for several years. She suffered migraines and neuralgia the rest of her life, for which she took both opium and morphine. The next three women, Anita Berber, Billie Holiday, and Gracie Slick, were all celebrated entertainers of their times. Anita Berber was an exotic dancer and singer who entertained Berlin audiences in the early 1920s. Known for embracing drugs of all kinds and truly daring in her performance art of the day, she was famous for her cocaine dance. Let's see if here's a few of her. Through her body, of which one critic said, her cocaine jig it was called, through her body's movements she expressed the euphoria, paranoia, and despair of a cocaine jag. Billie Holiday, the celebrated jazz singer, struggled with opiate addiction most of her adult life. Because she was a successful, high-profile black entertainer, she was hounded by the Bureau of Narcotics. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI repeatedly set her up and busted her. Early on, she argued that drug addiction was a medical problem, not a criminal problem, when hardly anybody else was saying it. Gracie Slick wrote White Rabbit, which can be called the anthem of the psychedelic movement. Feed your head are the words of the dormouse to Alice, as well as the serpent to Eve, the shamanic call to enter new realities by the means of sacred medicine. Moving forward into the 20th century, the exploration of mind-altering drugs was primarily in the hands of anthropologists and researchers. There was little social or spiritual context for tripping in the early 1900s, like was to develop in the 1950s and 60s. However, in 1914, on the eve of World War II, Mabel Dodge Lewin, who was an American heiress and an avant-gardist living in Greenwich Village, she, with her friends, had a tiny bit of knowledge and an adventurous spirit and a bag of peyote buttons. She wrote the first account of a peyote trip in white America. This is from her diary. Now, Raymond told us about a peculiar ceremony among the Indians he lived with that enabled them to pass beyond ordinary consciousness and see things as they are. He said they used an Indian medicine called peyote in the ceremony and sang all night long. He told us the Indians of the peyote cult were the most sober and industrious of all, that they made better beadwork and seemed to be able to recover old designs through their use of the stuff, and to become imbued with a nobility and a fervor greater than those who didn't. While this trip among 9 friends was chaotic and disorienting, even terrifying when, I'll get another picture of her, I think, yes. Even terrifying when one of the participants left the house, it was Mabel's destiny to marry a Pueblo Indian to whom God was in the peyote. 6 years later, when she was very ill, her husband gave her the medicine in tea form and she had a classic transformation. Beginning with the inmost central point in my own organism, the whole universe fell in place. I in the room and the room I was in, the old building containing the room, the cool, wet night space where the building stood, and all the mountains standing out like centuries in their everlasting attitudes. So on and on into wider spaces farther than I can divine, where all the heavenly bodies were contented with the order of the plan, and system within system interlocked in grace. I was not separated and isolated anymore. The magical drink had revealed the irresistible delight of spiritual composition, the regulated relationship of one to all and all to one. All things are really related to each other. Mabel used the term expansion of consciousness long before it was to become idiomatic some 40 years later. What we now know as psychedelic pioneers are represented in the next series of images. Gordon and Valentina Wasson. Gordon Wasson was an East Coast banker who developed a deep interest in hallucinogenic mushrooms. He visited Maria Sabina in Oaxaca in the 1950s, and with his photographer, Alan Richardson, became the first Westerner to be guided on a mushroom trip by Maria Sabina. He credited his wife with changing him from a mycophobe, fear of mushrooms, to a mycophile, lover of mushrooms. This all occurred on their honeymoon and is a favorite story in psychedelic history. Valentina and her 17-year-old daughter, Masha, also ate mushrooms with Maria Sabina several days later, each having positive experiences. Laura Huxley, this is Laura Huxley, Anais Nin, and Adele Davis. Laura Huxley was the wife of Aldous Huxley. She and her husband developed the concept of psychedelic guides and provided that to each other. She gave him LSD intravenously on his deathbed to assist his passage from life. This was in 1963, so it's taken another 50 years of faithful perseverance to bring forth the value of psychedelics and their ability to transform fear and resistance to the dying process. The hospice movement, which began in England almost 100 years ago, is relatively new in the USA. and combined with the populace's near universal acceptance of the medical marijuana movement, our community's rights of dying may have some far greater options. Val Corral, a great medical marijuana activist from Santa Cruz, is creating a hospice for her community, a B&B called Bud and Breakfast. Oh, I'm out of sequence here. Okay. Anaya Snin was one of the artistic elite that was offered LSD in the psychotherapeutic setting in the 1950s. Though she called her experience the most pleasurable sensation I have ever known, like an orgasm, she ultimately concluded that the world LSD opened was accessible to the artist by the way of art and should be used sparingly. She feared repeated use of psychedelics would dull the natural access to creativity and the subconscious. Jane Dunlap's, this is referring back to that picture of three women. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of sequence here. Jane Dunlap, Exploring Inner Space, is the name of the first book written by a woman on LSD. It was written by Adele Davis, the famous nutritionist, and is an account of her psychotherapy when the drug was legal. Her trips were high dose, positive, and transforming. Her daughter once said that LSD was that drug that makes mommy terribly nice for a whole month. Her publishers and later her estate forced repression of this book and all references to her acid trips. And Alice in Wonderland, she is one of the most beloved characters in the history of literature. Her inquisitive nature and innocent readiness for new experiences takes her on 9 drug trips during the course of adventures underground and through the looking glass. She eats psychoactive cake, hashish, drinks from a laudanum bottle, and eats a portion of an Amanita muscaria mushroom. She experiences time and space distortion, difficulty in thinking logically, physical transformation. She has meetings with stone creatures. Let's see, stone creatures who engage her in nonsensical games, and she has to endure an outrageous trial. Oops. The hookah-smoking caterpillar is the 19th century version of the Eden serpent, an old trickster coyote pushing a new drug, and also a shaman acting as a trip guide and counseling her to flow with the changes of her altered states. Alice proves to be a savvy tripper and achieves a perfect re-entry to her former life. The artist Sharana Harriet Francis participated in the Menlo Park LSD studies in the early 60s. She was a thoroughly straight woman who was tormented by a strict upbringing in a Greek Orthodox family. She had to submit a written account of her trip to the studies, did so, but felt words were hopelessly inadequate for the experience. 6 weeks after her session, she made this series of 18 drawings, a different one every day. They represent a classic descent into the underworld, transformation through dismemberment, and an ecstatic re-entry. Stan and Christina Groff called it a sequence resembling shamanic initiation in their book Beyond Death. An empowering lesson of her trip was when she was in the graveyard and terrified. I was in the clammy earth, surrounded by skeletons. I looked at my guides. Could they please help? They asked if I thought I could change the scene, suggesting I could imagine the horizon with the sun warming my chilled body. It was, I believe, the first time I entertained the notion that I and no one else had the power to change my own scene. I could be in control of my own reality, and I could move on. This was a new form of drawing for Harriet, and it emerged out of her single LSD session. She has written a book that was published maybe 10 years ago called Drawing It Out. And after that trip, she continued in deep psychotherapy. And in almost every transformative event of her life, she used drawings and her art to express her emotions and feelings. This is a very abbreviated, let's see, oh, that's from the 60s. I just thought it was. This is a very abbreviated survey because I'd like to address these days and these times. Certainly the themes are the same. The patriarchal paradigm that demonizes and criminalizes drug plants has a strong hold. Politics and profiteering has permeated drug trading and distribution, whether the drugs are legal or illegal. Greed and disconnection have made our own governments both policeman and pusher, commingling in a toxic union. We are coexisting with some very sick political forces who don't have a clue about the long term or the seventh generation. This point of view has no heart, it supports no life, and it makes everyone crazy. I was a flower child of the 60s, and my own psychedelic experiences made me want to be part of a larger weave. Later, books like Mothers and Amazons, The Chalice and the Blade, The Spiral Dance, Shakti Woman introduced me to goddess cultures, nature-based paganism, and the matriarchal principle of partnership. And all of it was being reflected by what was happening around me. Communal living was the norm, the intentional communities or co-housing of the day. It was fueled by idealism, drugs, and the desire for community, and a life that differed from our parents. In the 70s, people exited the cities and started to live their dreams, grow their own food and dope, and create little self-sustaining villages. The Back to the Land movement has evolved into Gaia consciousness and the idea of the stewardship of the land. Quietly, small groups have evolved medicine circles to develop healing and spiritual awareness. Internationally, there has been the organizing of the Millionth Circle, which brings together women's circles from all over the world in the name of ending nuclear arms and the development of lifestyles that connect us more to Mother Earth. And finally, some 50 years after the 60s, psychedelic research, legal and funded, has resumed, all of it directed towards medical therapeutic applications and end-of-life passage. While the authorities are a long way from approving of our inherent right to change our consciousness for such purposes as pleasure and bonding, we will take whatever leeway we can get. Certainly the pace of the 21st century is fast and furious, a model of chaos that needs serious balancing. The Burning Man has replaced the be-in. Addiction is rampant, and addiction to painkillers a startling departure, and very saddening for a generation of the 60s who tried to avoid the alcoholism of their parents' generation and had great hope for the connectability of psychedelics and cannabis. Ibogaine, one of the strongest psychedelics, has come to the awareness in the addiction therapy community for its phenomenal ability to interrupt an opiate withdrawal. The small body of psychedelic researchers, heroes and heroines of our times, will no doubt continue to find invaluable ways to use these very complex gifts. The value of the 60s continues to be controversial. Certainly in the past 10 years, as we've witnessed the co-opting of the media, corporate nepotism, the erosion of our civil liberties, and the rise of the religious right, this decade has suffered the harshest judgment. Yet for those of us who experienced it, you cannot suppress transformative experiences. For by imagining, we sow the seeds of future changes. My parents had some friends in Wisconsin in the late 40s who defined themselves as simple living volunteers because their consciousness of resources had been raised. They lived without electricity and plumbing, year-round, baffling and challenging all their friends with an early ecological awareness. But while the matriarchy hasn't emerged in the world theater of competitive social systems, she is alive and present. She is actually manifesting on the organic internal level in the ways she always has. It seems like as soon as we started to destroy the planet on a massive scale, with the discovery of atomic energy and LSD in the same year, 1943, we became aware of pollution simply from our own industrialized revolution. The perceptive feminist writer Jean Bolin has written much about the matriarchy, and with others stimulated the phenomena of modern women visiting sacred sites, part of the psychedelic tourism that has developed over the past 30 years. In her book, Crossing to Avalon, she conjectured that morphic fields proposed by Rupert Sheldrake may enable us to access images and rituals that have not been recalled for thousands of years. If morphic fields exist as a source of cumulative memory based upon our experiences as the human species, then these spontaneous rituals to the goddess by modern women are not invented but remembered. Through sacred medicine and altered states, meditation, dreams, or a variety of mystical states, a person who taps into the morphic field, or collective unconscious, gains access to transformation where time and distance are immaterial. Tapping into a morphic field at a sacred site, a pilgrim may receive intuitively a truer sense of what went on there than would a scholar with limited sources from later times. I'd like to close, I guess went through pretty fast. I'd like to close with a, oh, yes, that's it. I'd like to close with I am late, I'm sorry. I'd like to close with a quote from a young 25-year-old French-Canadian performance artist that I met in San Francisco. She was a serious tripper and created many performance pieces and art forms, both under the influence or following a calculated psychedelic experience. She wrote her master's thesis on medicine and art, and this is what she said. In my view, part of the solution to the catastrophic global and ecological present situation of mass species extinctions, deforestation, nuclear waste, water depletion, contamination, and overfishing of the ocean is to end the war on drugs, alleviate suffering, and enchant through the reality of white magic, mysticism, and entheogens as we learn to create a sustainable system of living for a whole planet. The experiential wisdom of entheogens brings about a communion through the sacred with nature, a feeling of oneness, as well as birthing innovative insights and limitless imagination. I have a great hope for the conscious psychedelic pilgrim of the future who can hold such perspective.